Yeah, so this is actually a super interesting story, and we'll probably have a couple twisted turns you may not expect. So I've actually, I think, competed against every Olympian in diving since 1992. Went to the World Championships, became a world champion. The first time I went off the diving board, I was 10 months old. The thing you need to accomplish when you do it is there's no money in the sport. A very shockingly large percentage of the people walking out are bankrupt. I was doing things that a normal 5-year-old shouldn't be doing. You don't look at the barriers in front of you. You look at what can you do to control that. For that, we won every single meet, every dual meet, conference meet, and NCAA championship meet. You don't think of the obstacles in the way. You just have, if I can still do it, how hard can I push myself? To how far can I get? So that for the rest of my life, I'll have that answer.
Hi, I'm thrilled to host Chris Millican, who is an elite level diver and has won multiple medals for US in international world championships. He has competed against almost every other Olympian since 1992. In this episode, you'll get to know the mindset and the attitude that these kind of people have to become the best in the business. Hey Chris, thanks for joining into our podcast. I really believe with your journey. It's super interesting. When I heard about it, I was super impressed and the kind of twists and turns it went through and all the kind of different experiences you had. And I'm very sure with your experience, our listeners will learn a lot and will be able to apply them in their journeys. Yeah, welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, cool. So let's start from your childhood, right? Let's go through your deep roots, where you born and brought up. How was your upbringing? What are the kind of interest you built during that time? What are the kind of events that happened during that time? And let's go through your journey bit by bit. Over to you.
Yeah, so would you like me to tailor kind of my journey to some of my athletic experiences, or kind of talk about my childhood and upbringings as a whole, and then how that intermixed with my athletics?
Yeah, let's start with as a whole, and then we can go deep dive each phases.
Yeah, so I think it's a kind of an interesting story and kind of biased and partial on that one. But I grew up in Ohio. I was the youngest member of a family, and on my extended family, it was actually kind of a large family. One of the things that is very kind of unique to my family is one, it's filled with very interesting characters. We'll say that there's when you meet some of the Millican clan, there's not many people you'll have met like them. But then the other part is they're all very athletic. So I came from a very athletic family, and I was the youngest in my immediate family, but I was definitely the youngest of the extended family. So some of the influences of my cousins that I saw that were much older actually had a very big impact on me and how I grew my life and how I viewed the world as a younger child. Um, so I grew up in Ohio, and one of the things that for me was very, very common was a theme of my life was athletics and sports. So I grew up. My cousin was a professional hockey player. My other cousin was a football player. At the time, was one of the top high school football players in Ohio. I would think he won the Mr. Ohio award for football. And then he went to play for national championship teams at Penn State. These were all things that were happening as I was very young. So I always looked at the world that way. And then that helped heavily influence me as I started my own athletic journeys as well. So the sport that I achieved kind of the most success in and kind of spent the majority of my life in was diving, but it wasn't my only sport. I ended up in multiple sports at multiple times, starting from very young. So the first time I went off the diving board, I was 10 months old, and it's very interesting and long story in of itself. But then I started competitively swimming. I think I was about 2.5 or 3. I was also playing soccer, and then I was in I think in baseball. So I was in I think 3 sports by the time I started to dive when I was 5. And then that was a theme throughout my childhood as well, is that I was usually on 4 or 5 sports teams at the time for various different sports, in addition to any of the academic stuff that you would do as a kid, as a child. So athletics was a very strong theme for me.
Oh, really nice. And who were the influences, the cousins that we were talking about?
Hmm. Yeah, my cousin Jimmy was a hockey player. He was a lot older than me, so I think Jimmy is probably 15 to 20 years older than me. So when I was very young, he was very big into hockey. And then a cousin that was a little bit closer to me, but still significantly older, was Chucky or Chuck. And Chucky is, I would say, about 10-ish years older than me. So it was a very formative time of when I was, almost 10, like 8, 9, 10 years old, is when he was the high school football star. So I remember idolizing him as a kid growing up, going to all the games, thinking it was so cool that like you'd watch this guy everyone would cheer for, and then I'd get to go hang out with him and go to dinner with him at the end. And then when he went to college, he played at Penn State during kind of the Penn State heyday of like that 94, 95 like Rose Bowl national championship teams. So I remember looking up to him very much so there. So for instance, I was at the game, so the Rose Bowl, when he set the Rose Bowl record for most interceptions game. I just remember how cool that was. But then I remember how much it impacted kind of the way that I viewed the world and I looked at it. Not necessarily because I looked up to them. It was because I wanted to be better than them. I wanted to accomplish things that they hadn't accomplished yet. And that was actually something that from a very, very young age was kind of ingrained into a lot of my mentality. My family, once again, the Millicans were a bit of characters, but we're hyper, hyper, hyper competitive. And it was something that when I would see them, thought it was very cool. But in the back of my mind, I always wanted to one up them. I wanted to, when it was all said and done with, be the more accomplished, be the one that won that competition. So that was very, very impactful for me in many different ways.
Wow, super interesting. Like super accomplished family background, it seems so in athletics. So now, how did you start working on the diving, and how did you got introduced to diving classes? And who introduced to you? How was your first impression? Did you initially like, was it like super interesting, or was it like, okay, somebody is compelling me to actually go and do the diving classes?
Yeah, so this
How
is
did it get started? Let's start from there.
Yeah, so this is actually a super interesting story, and we'll probably have a couple twisted turns you may not expect. So, the first time I went off a diving board, I was 10 months old. So starting very, very far back, I learned to walk very young. And when I learned to walk, I didn't take the normal like take two steps and fall down thing. I was just completely mobile. So I started walking around a family get together to steal food off of people's plates. And a couple days later, we were at a local pool, and my mom was just kind of laying down, not too used to her 10-month-old being completely mobile. And I guess I saw people going off the diving board and thought, that looks cool. So next thing she knows, like she looks down, I'm not there, and she goes into a bit of a panic because she thinks someone kidnapped her kid. So she panics, she's creates a scene, gets the lifeguards involved. They're about to call the police, and then they look up and they see this 10-month-old just running down the diving board. And so I hit the water, sunk like a rock. And the lifeguards had to come in and save me. But I kept diving from then. Like I never really stopped. So when I was about two and a half or so, like the pool actually came up with this rule. In order to go off of the diving board, you had to swim an unassisted 50 yards or 50 meters to be able to go. And it was targeted specifically for keeping me off the diving board. So we went to the pool. I went to go up on the diving board. The lifeguards were prepared and they came in to stop me, and they told my dad about this new rule. And they said, well, Chris can't go on the boards anymore because we have this new rule in place. And my dad told them that they couldn't tell me I wasn't allowed on the board because they haven't given me a chance to swim, to do the 50 meters. So he explained to me that in order to be on the diving board, you had to swim a 50 meters with no life. You can't touch the rail, you can't touch the swim lane, you can't use like the water wings or anything like that. So he said I then did the the world's most slowest but most determined 50 meters up and down the pool so that I could continue diving. And since I topped their rule, they couldn't actually take me off the board. So I kept diving. And then may have been 3 when I did that, but I kept diving for a few years. And when I was about 5 years old, I was doing things that a normal 5-year-old shouldn't be doing, and I wasn't doing them well. And someone had told my mom about this coach that had just started a collection of all the local high school athletes for diving and had pulled them together team. So my mom went and talked to him to see if he would take on a 5-year-old as well, because she was worried I was going to hurt myself, and I probably was going to. So I was very fortunate because he did take me on at that point. It was all the local high school kid area athletes and then myself. And then Chris was his name as well. But so Chris was just starting out in coaching, but in the end, he turned into a national level and elite level coach. So I actually got very fortunate that the random guy that was just starting up a team took on a 5-year-olds, but then turned out to be an exceptionally talented coach at that. And then it went from there. So I started competing locally at that time. I started competing, I think, nationally at I think around 7, and then internationally around 14.
Oh wow! In such initial years, like it is super exceptional actually. And how was your lifestyle at that time? How did your day look like? How did you? Like, what are the different things you did? How was your hygiene and nutrition and everything? Right. Let's get a little bit detail into how did your day look like during that?
Yeah, so some of these answers once again might be a little surprising. So what was first thing you'll have to know if you're kind of going to envision a young me is I was very, very, very hyperactive. So I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder young, probably like 9, 10 years old range, but I was really hyperactive. So lots of energy. And then what my days went like is obviously you'd go to school. But then right after school, I'd start going to sports practices. I would go directly from school to soccer, from soccer to swimming, from swimming to baseball, or baseball to diving. And I was always involved in many different sports. Diving was a later practice, so usually started around 7 p.m. Then you'd be in the water for about 2.5 hours. And then that was about an hour away from where I lived. So I would finish up at like 9:30, come home, honestly, we'd get fast food along the way. So I ate McDonald's almost every day as a kid, and then would get to bed around 10:30 or so, starting when the schedule probably started when I was around 7, and then do it all over again the next day. So in school, I was actually oftentimes very tired. I would sleep through a lot of classes and then go up and do all my sports stuff again later. You'd ask what my nutrition was. I poor. The thing is, when you're doing this much activity, like you actually can eat whatever you want, and you oftentimes have to eat very high calories to just persist and retain. So I was very, very, very lean, very, very, very skinny, but I was eating McDonald's every day. I was eating multiple lunches. We had to like buy multiple lunch or convince the lunch ladies to give me multiple lunches at school. Yeah, those type of things. So never really did the eat very healthy things. You never really had to.
Oh, nice. No, that's true. If you burn so many calories, you'll need to take in so many calories, right? Do you remember any events that happened during that phase in the initial days that actually shaped you as a person, as an individual, and maybe in the later stages of your life, they may have helped you in decision making in different situations? Do you remember any such situations that you faced?
Yeah, it's a good question. Situations from that time that would have shaped me. I think if we're talking in the early childhood, it would have been one of like in the early athletic careers. I remember that once again, I was very young going into this team of much older people. I was also a very young athlete in a family of very accomplished athletes. And I was also very hyper competitive. And I remember very vividly, I didn't want to seem like the little kid on the team. And so I'm about 5.5 years old at this time. Next youngest person's probably freshman, sophomore in high school. So think like 14, 15. In my 5-year-old mind, I felt that people wouldn't look at me like I was the little kid if I could beat them. If I could beat them athletically, then I would be one of the big kids like they were. And that was always something that drove me with my cousins too a little bit, was I wanted them to see me as one of the big kids, one of them. And they always treated me like that. And for better or worse, and sometimes hilariously so. But so I remember very vividly thinking, if I can just beat all of them, they'll look at me as one of the big kids. So I could generally do that by around 7. By around 7, I could beat all of the local area high school divers. And that's when I started to expand a little bit more nationally. And then there were a couple people, about 2 in the country at that point, that were kind of similar in those regards, where we were just very far ahead of, people our age. And so we started to push each other. And for us, it was fun. For the other people, it might not have been, because we were so young that there wasn't age groups crafted for us at the national levels. So we would do what's called diving up. So when I was 7, I would compete in a 9 and under event for local competitions. Then since an 11 under event on top of that, but then at national levels, you could only start advancing at the 12, 13-year-old age group. So every competition I would go to at that point, I was diving 9 and under, 11 and under, and 13 and under, just because I knew when we were going to start going to the national levels, we had to compete 13 and under. So there was one or two others that were doing the same thing, and it was fun because we would just win all the events, and it'd be first or second, flip around the podium between all of us. So you'd see these pictures of these 7-year-olds winning, 7, 8-year-olds winning, and then a bunch of really upset like 13-year-olds that then quit the sport probably the year after. But for us, it kind of was shaping in terms of at an early age, I wanted to prove myself through winning. And then when we got to the larger stages, the age gap was never a thing. We never thought, oh, we shouldn't be better than them because of X, Y, and Z. We just went out and did our thing, and we just happened to win. And those are things that were shaping, because then you don't look at the barriers in front of you. You look at what can you do to control that. Man, I think if you start to think back and trace that back from a mentality perspective, where that's learned, where that's trained, you start to see early stuff. A coach that took a 5-year-old on with the high school team and said, go swim for yourself. A kid that was hyper competitive, that came from a family of hyper competitive people that wanted to push those boundaries, and then a goal that you work to, or you just identify this goal in your mind of like, if I do this, then it makes all the other stuff right. Then you only focus on that.
Oh, that's great. Can you talk about your journey to the national and international level, and like which kind of competitions you actually competed with? How was the performance there? If you can talk about specific where you actually competed, and how was that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's multiple different circuits for national championships. You have the junior national circuit, which is age group based. So under 18, there's 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 to 18-year-olds, and you're bracketed against the people in your age range. There's a masters national circuit, which is again similar. It's age grouped again, but it's for adults, kind of more, a little bit more casual, a little bit more leisurely. Some good athletes will do it after their careers. So, and that's again 21 to 25, 25 to 30, and then goes all the way up. So I actually know athletes that were in their hundreds doing master circuit. And then you have what's called the senior national circuit, which is completely age group irrelevant, right? So it doesn't matter how old you are, it matters how good you are. This is where they pull the main national teams, the main Olympic teams from. So I at various stages have actually competed at all three of those. For when I was a junior, I was obviously doing all the junior nationals. I did do masters nationals and international competitions times for fun when I was coming back out of retirement. And then, but my main thing that I was focused on was the senior national circuit, which to me was the main focus. Is always push yourself as far as you can, push yourself to see where you can be, and if you're going to do that, that's senior nationals. So yeah, those are the stages of the competition. I started competing junior nationals around that same time. So we would do all those kind of local competitions. Then you'd go into these kind of not feeder competition, but qualifying competitions. So you have a regional meet, which is kind of for your area of the country. I think there's probably like 10 or so regions. Top 12, I think, if I remember correctly, were qualifying out at that point in time. From when you qualify to regionals, you go to a zone meet 2 weeks later. There's, I think, 4 of those. There's 4 or 5 of those in the country, and top 5 would qualify out at that point in time. And then those people that qualified out would go to the U.S. National Championships, which was done once a year at that point. And then, that's nationals. And you do that for all your age groups.
Oh, nice. And now, can you move towards how you started training for the US nationals and I think Olympics as well, right? You started training with other people and the other divers, right? Can you talk about those training days? How was it? How did you, again, like how did your day look like? I think at that time you might have reduced the other games that you talked about, right? I actually wanted to deep dive a little bit into how does the training at that level look like,
Yeah.
right? And who were the big people who ended up becoming super famous? Who were some of them that you actually competed with, right?
Yeah.
And what did you get to learn from them? What they learned from you? How did you stand against them and everything?
Yes. So I've actually, I think, competed against every Olympian in diving since 1992. So everyone that I think really it was Mark Lindsay on was I've competed against still to this day. And then Mark is actually an interesting person for the story, because Mark was one of the first ones. He was an Olympic gold medalist in 92 and 96. And he was one that had recognized myself, and then a couple of the others I just talked about when we were really young, and he kind of took over a little bit of a mentorship role, and which we thought was just really cool. He's paying attention to us. But in terms of the training side of it, there's a couple of different parts of my journey which are going to be substantially different on this. So there's how I was training for junior nationals when I was a kid, how I trained collegiately when I was competing in college, and then how I trained at post college, which was when I was competing against the senior national circuit. So in junior nationals, while I started off as a kid that was just by myself with all the high school kids, other kids started seeing me dive and had also started signing up and diving. And so my coach had created a junior program that was around it. And then of those junior programs, a couple of the other athletes from the team also became elite level. So that we created within our own club program, we had the elite section of it. It was called the Rippers. Our team was the Akron Rippers. So the main Rippers were the collection of junior divers, male and female, different age groups. We were all competing at the junior national circuit. And from there was, varying different things. So we had people that were very accomplished on it. I think that there were times where if I went one-on-one, I don't remember if there's anyone on the Rippers that could individually beat me. There were others like on the female side that were actually probably ranked a little higher than me nationally, so they're very good, but you have different degrees of difficulties or levels there. So we would push ourselves, but then the main time when I started to compete was in college. So I was very fortunate to be a diver on the Auburn University swimming and diving program, starting in 2002 was my freshman year. So starting my freshman year, I think it was about 6 or 7 years after that, we won every single meet, every dual meet, conference meet, and NCAA championship meet. We set the NCAA record my freshman year. We broke it my sophomore year. It still stands today, I believe. In a nutshell, that team was stacked. The team was so talented on both the diving side and the swimming side. So talented that I was actually by far the least talented person in that room. And so it was myself, it was other national team members from the diving side. Caesar was an Olympian in '04. Matt was, I think, the youngest world champion, if I remember correct, or if not on the order of that. But Matt was one of those kids that I was telling you about before that was just always leaps and bounds better than his age. And he actually progressed to a much higher level. So it's him, myself, we had Steve that came in the next year, we had Andrew that was there. So diving wise, we were set. Swimming wise, even stronger. We had, I'd have to look at the numbers, but between all the teams on men and women's side, it's like 30 or 40 Olympians, including many Olympic medalists, many Olympic gold medalists, many world record holders, many people that if you're watching the Olympics, you knew them. They were common names. So in those scenarios, it's very different, right? What was special about that team was how competitive we were with each other, how much we would push each other in doing it in productive ways. So what that would mean is I was always obviously very competitive. Everybody else that was around me was equally or more so competitive, and nothing that we did we'd ever want to lose on, whether it's as trivial or as meaningful as a competition or as trivial as we're blowing bubbles like with bubble gum and realize the other person was doing the same. So you had that mentality, but then we also encouraged it. So we used to do things where we were at practices and we realized that myself and like Matt would be on the same dive. We were doing the same thing. And I would challenge him, or he would just come up and challenge me. And we had a whole like ritual of how we did it, which made it fun. But like he would challenge me. It's like which basically I'm gonna do this better than you, or you're gonna try to do it better than me. We'd have either our teammates or our coaches actually judge us, and then it was something that we cared more about than almost anything else we were doing. So we fostered that competitive nature. And then post-college career, when I came back into the sport, I was training out at Stanford, and there was some unique like dynamics at Stanford, which was I was actually very old at this point. For the sport is dominated by the young. Stanford there's some NCAA stuff, so I couldn't train with the NCAA teams because of different violations there. So I was training within their club programs, and Stanford had a master's team, which is adults going up until whatever age. They had a junior program, which is one of the top elite programs. I, because of my age, was training on the master's team, but because of skill level and kind of what we were aiming for, I was also training a little bit with the junior teams and helping mentor over them and set some of that team and culture. So I would take over a mentorship role of some of the elite athletes that they had on that program. And then we had some people there that were able to actually push me and were at similar levels, and we would have that same competitive nature. And then again, everything was a competition. And like we do our strength and conditioning, and we'd set up like competitions like who could do the most pike ups in 10 seconds type stuff. So that helped guide that.
Oh, super awesome. And can you now delve into the injury that you ended up happening? When it happened, what was the situation in your phase, right? In your journey? How did that impact and how did it go about, right? Let's take delve into that journey.
Yeah, so the injury itself was I had a severe slap and labral tear in my left shoulder, a rotator cuff tear, and a torn and shredded bicep. In terms of when it happened, I don't know. The reality is it happened sometime when I was younger, probably either high school or early college. And it was something that you just dealt with. You're always diving hurt. You're always all athletes are always in pain in some way. So that's normal. It was definitely there when I was in college from the entire time I was there. It was misdiagnosed several times with tendonitis, which is always a joke that tendonitis is what doctors say when they don't know. So had multiple diagnoses of tendonitis in it, and it was getting pretty bad, which is actually how I only dove for my first 2 years of college, and the shoulder was a very big portion of that. And then when I came back into the sport, it was something where it was always in pain for a very long time and severe pain, until we were ultimately able to get it properly diagnosed and identified, and then fixed. The thing about it is you just put it out of your mind to a little bit. You, once again, going back to what we talked about before about how you don't think of the obstacles in the way, you just have the thing you need to accomplish and you do it. This is it. This is how athletes go through and fight through injuries, is your mind just stops thinking about it. So you feel it, but you don't feel it. It just becomes part of it. And if you want what you're wanting, your goals enough, all you care about is getting to the next thing, or achieving those goals. So that was it for a lot, especially when I came back from the sport. It did progressively keep getting worse, worse and worse. It also was impacting my abilities to compete and perform. Like, in addition to having severe pain, it was also very weak and wasn't having the mobility it needed. So it was actually affecting the performance. It was able to get diagnosed properly when one day, I lost all use of my arm, actually, which happened frequently enough, and usually I just pop everything back in. This time I couldn't get it back in. One of the families that I was telling you about, are the kids that I was mentoring over at that time. He was on the older side, so later high school. His family had, three of the kids were all athletes on the top programs. But then their family was also a family I was very close to because we're all Cleveland sports fans. So that, and they lived in San Francisco also. That day we had Ted drive me home because I couldn't drive my car. And then fortuitously, his dad is like head of orthopedics for UCSF. So when Ted drove me home, Ted Sr. said, "Let me take a look at what's going on here." He realized he probably knew that night what I had, but then he sent me to his top shoulder specialist and shoulder surgeon, who instantly diagnosed it, because I was very fortunate to have access to this world-class physician. And then he did the operation on it. And then after the operations were done, I was able to continue the career in a much stronger way than I ever had been.
Oh, nice. From your diving career, right? You transitioned to building a startup. How did that transition happen? Like, why did you like move away from diving and get into building a startup? What was your mindset? Why did you ended up doing that?
Yeah, so I said earlier that diving is dominated by the young. It's a sport that's dominated by the young. And there's two reasons for that. One, your body breaks down, and my body broke down. Two is there's no money in the sport. So if you look at most people, when they think of like high level athletics, you think football, basketball, baseball, these $1 million contracts that are coming around. Diving isn't like that. There's no money in it. Most sports, there's no money. So when you watch the Olympics, you see the opening ceremonies, the secret that no one talks about is a very shockingly large percentage of the people walking that are bankrupt. So what happens usually is you graduate from college in smaller sports and then you start your career. I was that way too. I graduated. I had already stopped because of shoulder was already hurting. I was no longer an athlete in my mind at that point. And you start your career because I have to have a career. I have to fund myself. I have to set up a life because that's what you do after college. So I started that. I got very fortunate to have
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
When was this? Can you talk about
the
the
year it was
year?
2007.
Okay.
Yep. So and I was very fortunate in terms of how I ended up in the startup that I did. Was I just moved to San Francisco. Very ironically, US Nationals were out at Stanford 2 weeks after I got here. I had teammates that were good friends that were still competing. I didn't have a job or anything at that point. So I went to Stanford to hang out at the pool for a couple weeks while everyone was diving before I got a job. The master's coach for Stanford and some of the other people at other coaches at Stanford had realized that I just moved out there and were trying to convince me to come back and train into their programs. But one of the things that the coach had done was introduce me to people on the team, on that master's team, the more the adult side, that could help set me up in a career. One of which was a guy named Jan, who is one of the biggest mentors and influences in my life. And he was doing a startup at that time. And without knowing me anything, had said, like, asked me if I was asked if I was in computer science. And then I graduated. I was like, yes. He's like, do you want a job? I'm like, also, yes. So I interviewed with the company a couple days later and it was a fit. So that's how I ended up being involved in that startup at a very early stage. Was ironically very much through luck, but also through the sport. And it was also through that kind of interaction that was set the path for me getting back into the sport. So that day when the coach was trying to recruit me to come dive with the team and do stuff, I decided to, bounce around on the boards for the first time in 3 years at that point, I think. So I started bouncing around on the boards and was having fun. And then when I started working, I did the master's thing for a little bit, mostly for fun, just kind of it was something that I could do. And then once I started doing that, I competed at some of the masters national championships and became a masters national champion, went to the world championships, became a world champion. But to me, it wasn't at times that much of a challenge for me to compete at that level. So, but with my mentality, that competitiveness of it, I wanted to start pushing myself more and seeing where it could end up, because to me that was what was very fun. And I also knew, athletics, it's a short time span. You have a short life in athletics. There's an expiration date on you. And I had already really passed my expiration date at that point. So I wanted to say, like, if I can still do it, how hard can I push myself? To how far can I get? So that for the rest of my life, I'll have that answer. So that's how I started going through it very much more seriously again. That's how I started competing again at the senior national level, opposed to the masters national levels. And then I competed at the senior national level for the rest of my career up until 2020, actually, right until the pandemic.
I hope you learned a lot from Chris's journey. The next part will be out soon.